All right, this is the Think Big for the Verify testing team for August 4th. This is actually a Think Small session today. So this is follow-up from last week's Think Big around user-defined MR widgets. I'm gonna do a quick recap, which is mostly reading from the doc, and then we'll jump into the Think Small part. So we identified that for some data, the reason for an MR widget is there's data that users are generating as part of their CI pipelines that is not showing up in a merge request, and it's applicable because either it should block or it's informative to a user. That's the problem that we have. And that there are different personas who might build an MR widget and might use an MR widget. The best example that I read through the notes is probably the security one, where a security researcher or someone on the InfoSec team or security team rather, is gonna create that widget for developers to see. So as part of that, we thought a great outcome or a really amazing outcome would be that there's a WYSIWYG editor that admins can use to build these widgets, decide what information appears in the widget, and decide a threshold for, hey, when will this fail the pipeline block a merge from the data? So that's a high-level recap of what I just read in the notes 10 minutes ago. Anything folks want to add to that Think Big part of it before we jump into our Think Small? All right. So jumping into Think Small, what do we think we could do in our next milestone to test out this problem?
This might be thinking too small, but
there's no such thing.
Drew has kind of found that problem that we identified with the merge request. Was it comparing reports to maybe not super correct things, and that's why some of the results in the widget aren't accurate. I don't think we can move on any of our grand ideas without kind of solidifying and making what we have right now useful. So I think the smallest steps that we can take in the next milestone is to actually fix the problems we've identified with the way that the reports are being compared, and then kind of get that ship righted in order to kind of move on from there.
All right. So that would be a good way of increasing confidence in the MR widget. One of the other things I didn't call out in the recap was part of the problem is also just the amount of data that shows up on the MR page today. Is there something that we could test around reducing that amount of data?
I was thinking about essentially demoting some of the widgets. So there's this fun table in the agenda that Ricky pasted in there. Thank you. Mm-hmm. And I got the idea that so I was thinking about widgets in comparison to the danger bot, and the danger bot is nearly an automatic process for us already. We trust it. It's like, there's a danger error, go fix it. It's a hard blocker for a merge request. That's the sort of thing that I think we want a merge request widget to be. And it lives in a comment that is, I think, by nature, a more suggestive sort of piece of content. And we have some widgets that are, theoretically things that are blocking. It's like, oh, it's red X on your merge request. And in practice, we read those like suggestions, and we're sort of like, oh, is there a code quality issue? Is there a security problem? I might go check that out again before I merge this. So I think by removing widgets that we're not very confident in to the level of we can automate review on these, it would increase the trust of the ones that remain. It'd give a status to the widgets that, this really is a blocker. So, we could make security violations and code quality comments, and then make DangerBot a widget. you know, a danger bot does a lot of sort of checks already. But essentially increasing trust in the widgets by removing, like taking an axe to the ones that aren't trustworthy and demoting them to comments and be like, these are remarks or suggestions that you should read, but you can merge without them.
Is there a even simpler iteration on that?
I don't know what the simplest version of remove a widget is.
It sounds like the outcome you want is that unless we're really confident that what is displayed in your widget should be fixed, shouldn't display it.
Yeah, what is just creating a model for a confidence threshold, like deciding how confident we need to be in something for it to be a widget. Mm-hmm. So if somebody wants to introduce a widget, they need to prove that it's this good. But I don't know what that scale is.
So we introduced a threshold in the web performance widget where it does not display unless, I don't remember which data point we used, but we kind of introduced that. Is there a way to look at data from users who are using it to see, hey, is this a good idea to add more thresholds so that widgets that actually appear are actionable and people trust that they do need to do something, whether it's blocking or not?
Yeah. So there's two kinds of thresholds in there. There's like the threshold of severity, right? If we of, you know, the widget says this is a warning or the widget says this is an error. And there's also a threshold of how confident are we that a warning is really a warning and an error is really an error. And I don't know how to measure that second one. It's like, I don't know, like I put up a merge request with like 12 critical security violations the other day. I was like, oh, yikes.
So I think for that, it's going to take a while to get us to the point where we are able to have that much confidence in the widgets. And I think we got to come up with a plan to get us there. That's going to be a little bit more long-term. And like I said, the first, and like you also acknowledged, the first step in building up that confidence is to fix some of the issues with the way the reports are being compared and make sure that there's a high signal to noise ratio in those MR widgets. From there, I think we talked about last time, we were talking about the checks API, or like how can we codify and allow for a configuration that allows people who use GitLab CI to say, hey, this needs to block merging and this shouldn't block merging, and having that kind of like, okay, this blocks merging if it says this, this blocks merging if it says this, and have that be configurable and customizable. And that way, after we start ironing out our widgets and we know, okay, actually, if the code quality widget says something wrong, something is wrong. And then we can toggle that setting that basically says, okay, block merges when the code quality widget is red. You know what I mean? Like having that flexibility. And you also don't want to, maybe, you probably don't want to mandate that across the app entirely. Like you don't want to say, okay, code quality widget now blocks merges for everybody, because different organizations are going to have different needs.
So we've talked some about, or the thread that we're on is increasing confidence in the widgets that are already there, so that when they appear, people know they need to do a thing, or we can trust that it should be a blocking
right. threshold.
What about the case for customers who have other data that already isn't in a widget? How would they, is there a way to tackle that problem in the next milestone for us?
So I was talking to Drew about this in our one-on-one. That's where the table came from, because we were having a conversation that was similar to this. The way that I have been looking at it is in kind of like rigidity to flexibility as a ratio. And then following along that ratio is the signal to noise. So the more rigid you can make a user defined widget or piece of information on a page, the better chance that you're going to have a high signal interaction. Whereas the more flexible you make something, so WYSIWYG or whatever, the more possibility that you're going to have a low signal to noise ratio. You're going to have more stuff in there. So the way that I was looking at that is kind of like, well, if we give somebody an MR widget that all it is allowed to say is like the title or a link and a red X or a green check mark, and that's it, that's pretty rigid, but that's going to be a pretty high signal to noise ratio. Like if you can say as a user through the API, you define this widget as a red X with a link to the thing that's why is this a red X, that's pretty high signal. But if you give them the full thing, they're going to have like a, you know, like a marquee blink tag thing in there with like a YouTube video with Rick Astley when the build fails and stuff like that. And that probably is going to be a lower signal than if we enforced a pretty rigid structure for that user defined widget.
Yeah, I think if you're rickrolled when you break the build, that's a great outcome we could go for. What if there, is there a way for us to back away from building any sort of MR widget, and can we make it easier for customers to just get data into the MR anywhere on the page, either through comments or something like that?
They could build their own danger bot at this stage, right? That takes a lot of effort, but we do support having some sort of triggered thing in your pipeline come back and plunk information in as a comment.
Mm-hmm. Seen Sonar integration that leaves a comment based on the scan from SonarQube, something like that.
Yeah, does anyone have a sense of how easy or difficult it is to post a comment from the end of a CI job?
You can take a look at qualities scripts that do that. That's how we do our test history. We actually have, they'll go search our issues database, find the matching issue to the matching test case name or test file name, and then add a comment there that has like the stack trace and information like that and where the build was. So you can see how Mark put all those API calls together.
Does it work the same way for a comment on an MR as it does for an issue? I mean, roughly.
It doesn't comment to an MR, but I would hope we have API calls for that.
Okay.
Programmatically, I think it's the same place. I think it's a generic notable.
I think you're right. I'll find a link to his scripts that he put up.
But is that do you think that's helpful for customers to sort of set up a little bit more of a mental framework where, you know, if you have something that's sort of suggestive, like you might want to go investigate, here's an easy way to post comments to your MR. And when you have something that you want to just turn on a big red light and say you can't merge, here's how you put it into a widget. Does that seem useful to our original problem of people getting good information into widgets?
I don't know that we can provide the structure we've validated that the information you're providing is useful. Like we can just give the framework for here's how you get information you want in a merge request into the merge request. And maybe that's a good starting point first of there's data you want to get into an MR that expose as for the artifact isn't enough. You want more context actually into the MR itself. Here's a way to do that. And then if the follow-on to that is great, but I also want to block merge, or I need to, you know, trigger some other action, then that would be a learning from a first step there.
Right.
So I think another reason why I think that having kind of that rigid structure with high signal would be like a good like 80-20 trade-off is because like actually making a user-defined MR widget that is super rigid is going to be a lot easier on the engineering side than
Oh yeah, for sure.
jamming another WYSIWYG into the MR thing, because that's going to be a whole can of worms.
Oh,
if,
yeah.
if it's just like you get some text and a link and you get a Boolean that you can flip, like that's a lot more simple.
Is there an even easier iteration? Is there something lower is there like documentation we can write? Is there a sample project we can set up? Is there a survey we could run that would help us answer the question, how many customers want more data into the MR that they're not getting today?
Yeah, I think that the problem validation would be useful. So it's like, what did people want? What do they want to put into the MR? Like, do they want an MR widget? Do they want less MR widgets? Are we putting too many MR widgets in there? Like, what's the balance? What are people feeling?
I think we've seen that, yes, we have too many MR widgets in there. I was wondering if we would go down the path of, hey, for our widgets, why don't we just hide them if they're green? Like you ran code quality, but it all passed, or you ran web performance and it's all green. We're just not going to display it.
I wonder if that's the difference between building something out like a checks API versus having MR widgets at all. Like if all the MR widgets were turned into the checks, the concept of a checks API, then you would just maybe display like little green check marks in a line or something like that. And then you wouldn't actually know about it until you clicked in, like, oh, this is the code quality green check mark, and this is the SAST green check mark. And it didn't show a bunch of stuff with lots of loading spinners and things.
All right, I'm gonna put a pause on what is the next thing we could build. I just want to flesh out a little bit of the hardest part. What I'm taking away from this conversation, I know, but I want to see what is the hardest part, or what does the team think is the hardest part of this problem to solve around giving a user, letting users put information into an MR.
That letting people insert whatever they want in a very open way decreases the strength of the signal in the merge request. The more freedom we give people, the less we know about what they've actually done with it. So we can't make assumptions and just say something's red, this is not mergeable. And yeah, I think that's a trade-off, is that we'll lose confidence the more generic the information becomes.
We being GitLab, or we being users of the product?
We as GitLab developers will be less confident in our assumptions about what the MR widgets do and what they mean.
Would a developer at Acme Anvil Corporation, if they built 3 of their own widgets and inserted them, have that same problem?
Is dogfooding a valid strategy for testing our product?
Legit.
Yes, but they might not have the same problem because they're not developing the merge request widget feature the way that we are. I don't know that they're going to come across. You see what I mean?
Yeah. So what I was interpreting as the hardest problem to solve is making sure that the data is of high enough quality that it means something to the user. But I don't know that that's our problem to solve. If you as an engineer at Acme Anvil need information about the tensile strength of the steel of the anvil as part of your build pipeline, great, we're going to give you a way to do that. And it's kind of up to you to understand your own context. Now we're going to do that with our own MR widgets like code quality and web performance and things like that. We need to understand those, but I don't know that we can build a interface that allows for you have enough context here in this MR widget to make it actionable to your own developers or not.
When I was
fair.
when I was thinking about that question about what the hardest thing to solve is, that my mind went in a completely separate direction.
Oh, okay, yeah.
For me, it seems like the MR widget space has no owner. Like there's no DRI, there's no person that's concretely responsible for MR widgets. I think the biggest challenge is going to be getting cross-departmental buy-in for revamping the MR widget section. Like just coordinating that with across stages, across departments. That's going to be like that would be a very difficult and large task.
Absolutely, yeah. No, yep. Agreed. And what would be then the riskiest part of building a thing here? Or of solving this problem?
Making it worse before we make it better.
MR widget proliferation. Or like tribbles.
Gremlins?
Gremlins, that's good, yeah.
Yeah, what's the data that an MR widget relies on? I mean, if we get too many various widgets applied to an MR, I mean, we are talking about possible performance issues too, right?
Slows the page down, yeah.
Yeah, crunches all the numbers.
It depends on how we decide to do it. Like there's probably going to be a limited set of MR widgets that are built directly into the application. If we allow the users to define their own MR widgets, then it'll just be as simple as displaying what they gave to us. It wouldn't necessarily slow down the page if we're storing that information in a clever way and, you know, expiring it and not having it be calculated every time. I think the challenge is that a lot of the MR widgets that we do build into the application, we're actually calculating on the fly in order to display the results, particularly the ones where we have two reports that we're diffing and then putting output of that diff into the widget. That's a computationally expensive process.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of. If we're just taking text, you know, that they have generated in some other place, but they still have to generate it somewhere, right? So I was thinking of, yeah, so whatever pipeline time it takes for that. I mean, I don't know, but from a page perspective, I think you're right. That shouldn't affect it.
All right, let's circle back up in our last couple of minutes to, is there a MVC approach that we can take to getting data into the MR from a customer?
Doesn't the metrics widget kind of do that?
Yeah.
The custom metrics widget does it already. I mean, just use that as your baseline if we want to make a.
Is this just a marketing effort of the metrics widget? We could do like some kind of video tutorial and a blog post about like, here's what you can do. You should be thinking about this.
Yeah. A combination of.
You do your Anvil hardness pipeline.
There you go.
And use the metrics widget.
So a combination of the metrics widget, if you're at a premium, using expose as to show artifacts that you've generated that we're not parsing for you, and potentially like, and here's how you would add comments into your MR. Like here's 3 approaches to getting other information into your pipeline, and then looking at engagement with the post or the unfiltered video. That might be a good way of measuring, hey, is this a problem that people have? And then we could explore a different solution space for solving it. I think that would be, that's definitely a low tech and low engineering effort approach to it.
I don't know, James, it seems pretty boring.
Hey, we love boring solutions, right? There's a whole handbook page about that. You wait till you see the unfiltered video about tensile strength of anvils, though, man. Coyotes and all sorts of great stuff.
I'm excited.
Cool. Well, I will write up an issue. I will not schedule it and look for volunteers to help with that if it's something that we want to get scheduled into an upcoming milestone. I think that would be helpful to solve the, hey, people want more data into their MR from sources that we don't provide for.
Let's quick implement metrics usage tracking before we publish the blog post.
Sounds good to me.
One quick question. So the metrics, the MR widget for the custom metrics, it's literally just a dumping ground for everything you want to put into it. So it takes every possible thing. You know, if we're going to build on that future-wise to become a potential blocker, to be able to allow somebody to configure it to become a blocker, we're going to have, I think, probably multiple custom metric widgets show up.
Yeah, I think that whole area is ripe for more thinking big of what it
Yeah,
could be.
I think that simple user-defined widget is like the next iteration after we check on the metrics widget. Okay, can the metrics widget solve some of these problems? And what's the next iteration? Okay, we need this simple line of text link checkbox X. Maybe you have 5 of those if you're testing various anvil hardnesses.
Find more things to test by anvils too. I also may write up an issue about not displaying some of our widgets as a test. We may offer ourselves up as tribute to help clean up the MR page. Awesome. Thank you, team. This has been another great Think Big, Think Small, I think. I'll write up some issues and drop them into the channel and link to them in the unfiltered video if you're watching later, so you can click on those below. Thank you, Parker and Ricky, and probably Joanna. I saw you jump in late, but I assume that you also took notes because you always do. Thank you, everyone, for helping take notes and keeping us on track. All right, cheers, everyone.
Take care. Bye.